In this video, we are going to see about the nodejs architecture. So nodejs is an open source runtime environment. Now we are going to see about the nodejs architecture. So in the nodejs, actually this follow the single thread event queue. This uses the single thread event queue. That is for handling the multiple requests. This nodejs uses the single thread event queue. So when this event queue that actually receive the request from the user. So all the requests that is received initially by the event queue on the server side. So when the user sends the request to the server, so this is actually received by the event queue. So normally the request that is consist of two different types. One is a blocking request and another one is a non-blocking request. Here a even loop that actually execute top on the event queue. Even loop that execute top on the event queue. Initially the request is received by the event queue and the even loop that execute top on the event queue. So this even loop fetch one request from the queue. So this queue always follows the first in first out. So this even loop so that actually pick the first request and it started executions. And for executing the asynchronous IO, this node use the libu, that is actually C library. This is actually written by the C library. So here the nodejs allowed to add the add-ons that is written by C and C++. So this is actually processed by the libu, that is C library. Here the even loop that actually split the request, that is the blocking and non-blocking. So this blocking request that is put inside the thread pool. So here we are having the different types of thread for processing the different requests, and this thread pool that actually contain the different worker thread. Normally we are using the worker thread for satisfying or processing the request. So for example, for file system accessing, so this thread pool that has the separate worker thread, and this even loop that process the request that is fetched from the event queue, and if it's a non-blocking request and it executed internally using the nodejs resource that execute and send the result immediately back to the event queue, and that is actually given to the user. And if it is a blocking request, so that is transferred to the thread pool. Now this thread pool, we are having the different threads that actually handle the blocking request. Now this time the even loop that hand over this control to the thread pool, and it fetches the next request from the event queue so that it processes the multiple requests. So after finishing that work, the thread pool that send the callback to the that add the result to the callback queue, and that is actually processed by the event loop, and finally the result is sent to the event queue. So this is basically the node architecture. So now we see the workflow. So that's users send the request to the server, so for performing some operation. So here the request may be blocking request or the non-blocking request. So blocking request means so until complete the particular process, so here the remaining work is blocked, that is blocking request. So here the blocking request is handled separately so that here actually the even loop not blocked. So the request enter the event queue first at the server side. So when the client send the request, this actually enter inside the event queue. The event queue passes the request sequentially to the event loop. So this event loop that is run top on the event queue, this fetches the request one by one. Here the event loop check the nature of the request, whether it is a blocking request or the non-blocking request. Now the event loop processes the non-blocking request which do not require any external resources and return the response to the corresponding client. So if it is a non-blocking request and if it is handled by the node internal resources that actually executed by the event loop, and after executing, they send the result back to the client, and the even loop fetch the next request. And for blocking request, a single thread is purely assigned to completing the particular task using some external resources. So now if it is a blocking request, the even loop hand over that particular request to the single thread, and now the single thread handle this blocking request, and even loop that do the normal work, that is fetching the other client request. So after completion of the operation, the request is redirected to the even loop, which delivers the response back to the client. So now the blocking request, so that is assigned to the some other separate thread. So after completing that one, the intimation is given to the even loop. Now the even loop passes the response back to the client. So this is actually workflow of Node.js architecture. So here the request is initially received by the even queue, and the even loop that actually work top on the even queue, and it fetches the request and split the request into blocking and non-blocking. So non-blocking request, that is handled by even loop itself. After processing the request, the response is sent back to the client. And if it is a blocking request, separate thread is assigned for that blocking request. Now again the even loop do its normal work, that is fetching the next client request. So when the blocking request completed, so that is actually sent to the even loop, that is redirected to the even loop, and the even loop give the response back to the client. So this is actually execution flow of node.